Todd Monken just locked the Cleveland media out of his building. Not metaphorically, not as a temporary inconvenience or a cooling-off measure after a tense exchange. He made a deliberate, structural decision to remove beat reporters from access to his team's preparation sessions, and he did it in the first week of voluntary minicamp. I've been sitting with this story for a few days now, turning it over, examining it from every angle I can find. And the more I look at the full history that produced this moment, the harder it becomes to argue that those reporters ended up outside that building for any reason other than the choices they made about how to use the access they were previously given. Let me walk you through what actually triggered this, because the framing I've seen in some corners of the coverage strips away the context that makes Monken's decision not just understandable, but genuinely difficult to challenge. Voluntary minicamp, early May. 3 days of throwing sessions in shorts and helmets, non-contact work, no live defense, no padded practices, no game film worth analyzing, no real competitive evidence of any meaningful kind. 3 days. That is the sample that Mary Kay Cabot, the lead beat writer covering this franchise, decided was sufficient to publish her assessment that Deshaun Watson represented the more likely starting option over Shedeur Sanders, the quarterback Cleveland selected 5th overall in the draft, not after a full week of observation, not after watching multiple sessions under varying conditions. 3 days of voluntary May work, and she was already in print positioning the 5th overall pick as a secondary option behind a quarterback whose medical situation has been among the most uncertain in the entire league over the past several years. I need you to feel the weight of that timing, because it reveals something specific about the nature of the coverage this quarterback has been receiving. She didn't follow evidence toward a conclusion. She arrived at minicamp carrying a conclusion, and then gathered whatever 3 available days could provide to make it publishable. That distinction matters enormously, and it is precisely that distinction that explains everything Monken subsequently decided about the relationship between his organization and the reporters assigned to cover it. His response came in 2 stages, and both of them matter. He went on a podcast and addressed the competition directly, clearly, and without diplomatic evasion. No predetermined outcome. The evaluation would proceed based on real competitive evidence as the process developed. His decisions would be informed by what he actually witnessed rather than by narratives built from the earliest possible sample of the lightest possible work. That was the public statement. And then, almost immediately after delivering it, he removed access entirely. No reporters at training sessions. No cameras at the edges of practice fields looking for material that would be stripped of context and dropped into the next installment of a narrative that had already been running for a full year before this minicamp even started. He said what he believed, and then he built a structure around those words that removed the problem from his preparation environment in the most direct way available to him. An actual wall instead of a symbolic objection. But to understand why he felt compelled to build that wall, you have to go back through last season. Because what happened in Cleveland across that entire year is the foundation of this moment, and you cannot properly understand Monken's decision without understanding the environment Shedeur Sanders was placed into after that draft selection. This is the part of the story that deserves the most careful attention. It is also the part that the Cleveland media ecosystem, the same reporters now experiencing the locked door firsthand, almost entirely failed to cover with the seriousness it warranted while it was actively unfolding. Shedeur Sanders received 0 first-team repetitions in training camp. I want to be precise about that number because it matters enormously. Not a limited workload, not a carefully managed introduction designed to protect a young player from being overwhelmed before he was ready. 0. The Cleveland Browns selected a quarterback in the top 5 of an entire NFL draft, and then made the organizational decision to deny him the foundational practice repetitions that every quarterback needs to begin building the chemistry, the timing, the familiarity with his coordinator's system that forms the developmental baseline everything else gets built on top of. That decision had real, lasting, measurable consequences for Shedeur's ability to demonstrate what he was actually capable of when competitive opportunities eventually arrived. It was one of the most significant organizational stories of that entire season. It deserved sustained, aggressive coverage. It deserved the kind of repeated, informed questioning that beat writers with sustained daily access to a franchise are uniquely positioned to apply when an organization makes choices that directly undermine the long-term asset they are supposed to be developing. The Cleveland media left it largely untouched. No sustained pressure campaign, no consistent headlines forcing the organization to explain publicly why their 5th overall pick was being denied the foundational work every other starting caliber quarterback in the league was receiving. That particular story didn't generate the kind of engagement that keeps audiences consuming content, so it didn't receive the sustained attention it deserved. The coverage machine redirected its energy toward a target that had proven more reliably productive, which was Shedeur Sanders himself. Rex Ryan materialized materialized on national television and delivered what I can only describe as one of the more embarrassing performances I've witnessed from a football personality with his platform and credentials. He attacked Shedeur publicly, loudly, and on the record for not doing enough to get himself onto the first-team practice field. A veteran with decades of professional football experience, someone who genuinely understands how organizations function and how practice rep distribution actually works at this level, sat in front of a national audience and blamed a rookie quarterback for being unable to force his way into repetitions that the organization had made a deliberate decision to withhold from him. Let that logic sit with you. The Cleveland Browns failed to create the developmental environment their 5th overall pick required. Rex Ryan went on television and blamed the player for the predictable results of that organizational failure. And the follow-up question that should have been hanging in the air of every conversation that followed, the question about why the organization, rather than the player, wasn't being held accountable, never quite materialized with the force it deserved. Tony Grossi made the situation worse in a specific way that I think represents one of the genuinely indefensible moments in what became a sustained pattern. When Shedeur mentioned arm soreness, Grossi used it as an attack vector. He questioned the player's toughness on air. He questioned Shedeur's commitment to the game, essentially suggesting openly and in public that a quarterback who had been given almost nothing to do had no legitimate basis for experiencing any physical discomfort from that almost nothing. I'm going to state the obvious thing that apparently wasn't obvious enough to prevent this from making air. The organization controlled his repetitions. His body responded to its actual workload the way every athlete's body responds to its workload, which is to say, normally and predictably. A reporter then took that completely ordinary physiological reality and constructed a character indictment out of it, broadcasting that indictment to an audience that trusted him to apply real expertise to his analysis. That is not informed football commentary. That is someone with a platform using it to damage a young player's reputation through reasoning that falls apart the moment you spend 30 seconds examining it carefully. And then there is the larger pattern that Cabot assembled across the entire season, piece by piece, with the consistency and platform reach that the lead beat writer position provides. She called Shedeur undisciplined. She called him narcissistic. She produced week after week of content building the case that Dylan Gabriel represented the better competitive option, that the Browns may have miscalculated their draft evaluation, that opportunities being withheld from Sanders should probably be flowing toward Gabriel instead. She did this from the position of highest credibility in the local coverage ecosystem, which means her narrative carried weight and reach that amplified its impact well beyond what a peripheral voice could have produced. She built a sustained case against a first-year quarterback who had never been given a fair foundation to show what he was actually capable of. And when a new season arrived and the opportunity presented itself to approach the competition with genuine openness, she returned to the same conclusion she had maintained all year. 3 days. Watson the more likely starter. Same destination, same reasoning, different calendar. That is not reporting in any sense the word is supposed to carry. Reporting means following evidence toward whatever conclusion it actually supports, even when that conclusion is inconvenient for a narrative you've previously invested in. What has been happening instead is arriving at a conclusion through some process that precedes the evidence and then selectively assembling whatever is available to lend it the appearance of evidentiary support. Those are fundamentally different activities. One of them is journalism. The other is advocacy operating under journalism's cover. Monken watched this play out from inside the building, where the actual football was happening, from the position of someone who had access to all of the information that the reporters constructing those narratives did not have. He arrived at a conclusion about what this particular group of reporters had demonstrated regarding their intentions with their access. The demonstration had been clear, extended, and consistent. He removed the access. I want to address something that gets lost in the immediate reaction to decisions like this one. Media access to a professional football team's preparation is not a guaranteed right. It is a professional privilege extended in exchange for the implicit understanding that the access will be used to inform rather than to manufacture. When the use of that access demonstrates, over an extended period, that manufacturing has replaced informing, the organization extending the privilege is not obligated to keep extending it. The reporters can still write whatever they choose to write. Nobody has removed their platforms or restricted what they are permitted to publish. They are simply no longer inside the building while preparation happens, which means they can no longer use proximity to that preparation as a tool for constructing the next installment of a narrative that has been running regardless of what the preparation actually reveals. What I want people to fully grasp about this decision, beyond the immediate access conversation, is what it represents from a developmental standpoint for the quarterback himself. Media environments are not neutral external noise that players can simply choose to filter out through sufficient competitive focus. The narratives that circulate around a young quarterback seep into his environment in ways that are real, even when they aren't physically present inside the facility. They reach the people in his building. They shape the external perception that determines how his early career gets remembered and how his performances get contextualized in the coverage that follows. They demand active mental energy to manage and filter, which is energy that could and should be going directly into preparation. Every manufactured controversy carries a real cost. Every negative cycle that builds momentum in the coverage ecosystem creates static that bleeds into the spaces where focus is supposed to live. Monken watched Shedeur Sanders spend an entire season managing that static on top of a developmental situation that was already deeply inadequate, and he made the decision that the people responsible for generating that static had exhausted their reasonable claim to continued proximity to this quarterback's preparation process. There is also something being communicated here about the relationship between Monken and Sanders that goes beyond the access decision itself and speaks to what kind of coach Monken actually is. He went on a podcast and stated publicly, with clarity and without hedging, that this competition carries no predetermined outcome and that every evaluation will be honest and merit-based as real evidence develops. That is a public commitment of a specific kind. Closing the building is the structural reinforcement of that commitment. It is the difference between saying you believe in your quarterback and actually constructing the conditions in which that belief can be realized without interference from outside actors, whose track record regarding this quarterback is already thoroughly established. Monken has seen enough of what Shedeur Sanders is through everything that was asked of him last season, through the resilience required to operate inside that environment without the foundation he was owed, through the consistency of his preparation under circumstances that would have broken the focus of less grounded players, to understand exactly what he has in this young quarterback. His responsibility now is to build a wall around the developmental process and allow it to proceed without the people who spent last season undermining it having daily access to the next chapter. I genuinely believe that the attempt to frame Monken's decision as some kind of dramatic organizational overreach misreads it completely. He identified a specific, documented, extended problem. He made a concrete structural decision that removes the problem from the environment rather than issuing a statement expressing displeasure while leaving everything functionally unchanged. That is what real organizational protection looks like. That is what genuine support for a young quarterback's development looks like when the head coach is actually committed to creating the right conditions rather than simply saying the right things about it in front of cameras and then allowing the same corrosive dynamic to continue operating at the edges of the preparation environment. The reporters on the outside of that building understand exactly why they are there. They made a series of choices across an extended period about how to use the access they were given, and those choices are documented and available for anyone willing to examine them honestly. Monken examined them. He made his decision. And Shedeur Sanders is now preparing for a season inside a facility where the people whose coverage of him demonstrated precisely how that access was being used are no longer present to use it the same way again. The sequence of events that produce this outcome is entirely visible to anyone who looks at it without the protection of the narrative those reporters spent last season constructing. They weren't locked out arbitrarily. They were locked out consequentially. And the difference between those two things is the entire story.